Dinner that Friday night was supposed to be quiet. The table was set. The roast had been in the oven all afternoon, and for a brief moment I almost believed we'd have a peaceful evening. But peace, I would soon learn, can be as fragile as crystal. Sophie, my daughter-in-law, walked in already smelling of wine. Her heels clicked against the hardwood like a warning. She poured herself another glass before even saying hello. My son, Ethan, followed behind, nervous the way he always gets when he's caught between two storms. I tried to stay calm, asking about work, pretending everything was normal. Halfway through dinner, Sophie's laughter turned sharp. She rolled her eyes at every word I said, muttering things under her breath. I could feel Ethan shrinking beside her, too afraid to speak. By the time she emptied her third glass, her cheeks were flushed and her voice louder. She held her empty glass toward me, a command disguised as a gesture. "More wine," she said, slurring slightly. I looked at her, then at Ethan, and finally said as gently as I could, "I think you've had enough for tonight." That simple sentence changed everything. Sophie froze. The air grew heavy. Her expression hardened into something I hadn't seen before, pure contempt. "Who do you think you are to tell me what to do?" she hissed. "You think you still have power just because you used to be a judge. You're just an old woman now, desperate to control everyone around you." Ethan whispered her name, begging her to stop, but she wasn't listening. She stood up so fast, her chair screeched across the floor. Then in one violent motion, she hurled the glass straight at me. It hit my temple. For a second, I didn't even register the pain, just the sound of shattering crystal, sharp and final. Then came the sting, the warmth of blood running down my face, the metallic taste of disbelief. Ethan gasped, rushing to my side, while Sophie stood frozen, eyes wide, realizing what she'd done, but not enough to care. 30 years on the bench had taught me how to stay composed under pressure. I'd faced criminals who lied without flinching, victims who cried without end. But this silence in my own dining room, broken glass, sparkling in the chandelier's light, was something else entirely. I pressed a napkin to my wound and looked at my son. "Take her upstairs," I said quietly. My voice didn't tremble, even though my hands did. Ethan obeyed, still shaking. Their footsteps disappeared down the hall. A door slammed, and suddenly it was just me. Blood on my blouse, shards on the floor, the echo of her words ringing in my ears. I remember staring at the mess and thinking, this isn't about anger anymore. It was about something deeper: respect, safety, boundaries. For years I'd believed that love could fix any family conflict, that if I just stayed patient, things would change. But that night, I understood something new. When someone crosses the line between disrespect and violence, silence only feeds their power. So I cleaned the wound, took photos of everything: the cut, the glass, the stains. Evidence. I wasn't doing it for revenge. I was doing it for truth. Because justice, even when it hurts, is still the only way to stop the bleeding. Later, as I sat alone in the dark living room, ice pressed against my temple, I couldn't shake one thought. 30 years as a judge, and I had sent hundreds to prison. Yet I had never imagined that the first case I'd file as a victim would begin at my own dinner table. When Ethan told me he and Sophie wanted to move in just for a little while, I said yes, without hesitation. He's my only son, and the thought of having him home again felt comforting. They said they were saving up for their first house, maybe 6 months at most. 6 months came and went. At first I tried to make it work. I cooked dinner every night, made sure the laundry was done, and kept the house warm and welcoming. I wanted them to feel comfortable, to believe this home was still theirs too. But slowly the tone of our days began to shift. Little things turned into small irritations that grew louder with time. Sophie started coming home later and later, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, long after sunset. She'd head straight for the wine cabinet before even taking off her coat. Rough day, she'd mutter, filling her glass to the rim. Ethan would shoot me that look, half apology, half helplessness. I knew that look too well. It was the same expression I'd seen on defendants' faces when they realized they were trapped in situations they didn't know how to leave. At first, I told myself it was stress. Young couples struggle. Maybe work was overwhelming. Maybe she just needed space. But that optimism started feeling naive when the wine bottles piled up in the recycling bin faster than the groceries disappeared from the pantry. Sophie wasn't cruel all the time. Some mornings she was polite, even sweet, thanking me for breakfast or complimenting the garden. But by evening, the mood would shift again. One glass turned into three, and her words turned sharper. Sarcasm dripped from every sentence. When I asked about her job, she'd roll her eyes. When I spoke to Ethan, she'd interrupt. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was the energy she brought into every room. The air felt heavier when she was around, like the house itself was holding its breath. Ethan, poor boy, tried to keep the peace. He cleaned up after her, smoothed over her comments, laughed at things that weren't funny. He reminded me of the boy who used to cry when his friends fought on the playground, desperate for harmony, even when it wasn't possible. I kept telling myself not to interfere. It wasn't my marriage, and I didn't want to become the meddling mother-in-law. But boundaries blur when you share a roof. Every slammed door, every sarcastic remark, every uneasy silence echoed through my walls. The home that once smelled of roasted dinners and fresh flowers now smelled of tension and cheap red wine. I could hear it in the quiet too, the kind of quiet that hums with unspoken resentment. I tried to bridge the gap. I invited them to have family dinners, planned small movie nights, even suggested we go for walks after dinner to unwind. Ethan would always agree. Sophie would always find an excuse. The more I reached out, the more she pulled away, and the more Ethan seemed to vanish between us. Looking back, I can see the signs clearly. I just didn't want to. The quick temper, the dismissive tone, the sudden spending sprees she couldn't explain. I told myself it wasn't my place to judge, but judgment was second nature to me. I just didn't want to believe that the case I'd eventually have to examine would come from my own living room. That's the cruel thing about denial. It disguises itself as kindness. You call it patience, compassion, understanding. You tell yourself you're helping by staying silent. But silence isn't peace. It's the slow erosion of your safety, your confidence, your sense of home. By the time I realized how far things had gone, the warmth in the house had already turned cold. What used to be family dinners had become battlegrounds disguised as conversations. And every night I sat at that table, I could feel something cracking. Not the furniture, not the plates, but the fragile sense of family I had worked my whole life to protect. I didn't know it then, but those quiet, uncomfortable nights were building towards something explosive, something that would break more than a wine glass. It would break everything we thought we knew about love, loyalty, and what it means to share a home. It happened so quickly that for a second I thought I imagined it. One moment we were sitting at the dinner table, pretending everything was fine. The next, a glass was flying through the air. Before that, the evening had been tense, but quiet. Sophie was already tipsy when she sat down, swirling her wine like she was at some party instead of my dining room. She had that sharp tone again, the one that made every simple question sound like an accusation. When Ethan tried to lighten the mood, she rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically. I kept my voice steady, even though my patience was wearing thin. Years in the courtroom had taught me how to diffuse chaos, how to speak calmly when others shouted. But I wasn't behind a bench anymore. I was just a mother trying to keep peace in her own house. When Sophie held out her glass again, her hand was unsteady. The bottle was nearly empty. She didn't ask. She expected. The silence stretched as I looked at her, then at Ethan, who stared at his plate, like the pattern on it suddenly mattered more than the moment. I said it quietly, almost kindly. I think you've had enough for tonight. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a boundary. And in this house, boundaries had been disappearing one by one for months. Her eyes went wide for a heartbeat, then narrowed into rage. She laughed, but it wasn't the kind that comes from amusement. It was sharp, brittle, meant to humiliate. You think you can control me? You're not my mother. You're not even in charge here anymore. This is as much our home as it is yours. Ethan murmured her name, his voice soft and pleading, but she was past listening. She leaned forward. Her cheeks flushed. Her words slurred and cruel. You can't stand that your son has his own life now, can you? That you're just an old woman clinging to the last bit of authority you have left. The room spun into a kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. Then it did. The glass left her hand faster than I could react. It caught the light as it flew a quick flash of crystal and red wine, then shattered against my temple. For a second, I didn't even feel the pain, just the sound. The crack, the fragments hitting the table. The world seemed to slow down. Ethan was on his feet, shouting her name, rushing to me. I could feel something warm running down my face, blood. My vision blurred, but my mind stayed sharp. I'd seen worse scenes in courtrooms, but never in my own home. Sophie stood frozen, breathing heavily. Her expression a mix of shock and something else, almost pride. I reached for a napkin, pressing it to my temple. My hands shook, but my voice didn't. Ethan, I said quietly, take your wife upstairs. He hesitated, torn between us, but finally obeyed. Their footsteps faded down the hall, followed by the sound of a door slamming. The dining room fell silent. All that remained was the smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and the faint metallic tang of blood. I sat there for a long time, the napkin growing darker against my skin. The chandelier's reflection danced across the shards scattered across the floor. It was strange how beautiful something could look right after it's been destroyed. That broken glass marked more than a wound. It was the line between what I'd endured and what I would no longer accept. For years, I had let things slide in the name of keeping peace. I had swallowed disrespect, ignored small cruelties, told myself that patience was love. But real love doesn't require you to bleed for someone else's comfort. That night, as I cleaned up the pieces, I realized I wasn't just mopping up spilled wine. I was drawing a boundary with blood, if that's what it took. Sometimes it takes one violent moment to reveal how fragile your silence has made you. Sometimes saying no is the only way to remind someone and yourself that you still have the right to stand your ground. And that was the last night I ever poured Sophie a drink. The first thing I did was breathe. Slow, steady, deliberate breaths. The kind you take when panic tries to crawl up your throat, but you refuse to let it win. My hand trembled as I pressed a damp towel against my temple, feeling the sting of the cut and the steady pulse of my own heartbeat under it. The wound wasn't deep, but it bled like most head injuries do. I could still smell the red wine mixed with blood, sharp and sour. The white tablecloth, my mother's heirloom, was ruined. The once perfect dinner setting looked like a crime scene. And in a way it was. For years I'd sat across from violent men in courtrooms, each of them claiming they'd lost control for just a second. I never thought I'd hear that same silence in my own house after a glass hit my face, instead of a gavel striking the bench. I stood up slowly, refusing to let the dizziness take over. My reflection in the mirror showed a thin trail of blood curving down my cheek. I wiped it gently, not out of vanity, but precision. 30 years in the justice system had taught me something crucial. Evidence fades, but facts don't. So I did what I knew best. I documented everything. I took photos of the cut, the shattered glass, the stain spreading across my blouse. I collected the fragments into a plastic bag, labeling it with the time and date. Every step was methodical, almost automatic, like muscle memory kicking in after years of handling crime scenes. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about anger. It was about clarity. I needed to reclaim control of a moment that had stripped me of it. People often assume justice and vengeance are the same thing, but they couldn't be more different. Vengeance is emotional, it burns fast and blinds you. Justice is measured. It's slow, often frustrating, but it restores balance. That night, sitting alone in the dim light of my living room, I chose justice. I opened my phone, scrolled through the contact list, and paused for a second. My finger hovered over Ethan's number, but I stopped myself. He wasn't ready to see what I was ready to face. So I called someone else, the Miami Police Department. When the dispatcher answered, her voice was calm, almost routine. I could hear typing in the background. "Ma'am, what's the nature of the incident?" "I want to report an assault," I said, my voice steady. "It happened in my home about an hour ago." She asked for details, and I gave them all names. Addresses, the nature of the injury, the weapon used. I didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. I just spoke the truth, clean and clear. When she asked who the attacker was, I paused. The word daughter-in-law felt heavier than it should have. After hanging up, I sat there in silence. The house felt enormous, every creak of the floorboards echoing like footsteps. I realized that calling the police might change everything. My relationship with my son, the fragile peace in this home, maybe even how I saw myself. But doing nothing would change me in a worse way. It would make me complicit in my own harm. When the officer arrived just after sunrise, I opened the door calmly, even though my heart was racing. He was middle-aged, kind eyes, notebook in hand. I showed him the dining room, the glass still glinting on the floor. I handed him the bag of evidence and my phone with the pictures. He took notes while I spoke. "Do you wish to press charges?" he asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "She assaulted me." He looked up, studying my face. "And she's still in the house." "Upstairs," I said, "sleeping." He nodded, jotting that down. Then he asked something I didn't expect, "Ma'am. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Family cases like this can be complicated." I smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. I'd asked that same question to so many victims over the years. People who had bruises hidden under their sleeves, who made excuses for those who hurt them. I knew how tempting it was to downplay pain when the person causing it shared your last name. "Yes, officer," I said quietly. "I'm sure." As he wrote his final notes, I noticed my hands had stopped shaking. For the first time that night, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, just steadiness. The kind that comes when you take back what someone tried to steal from you. When the officer left, the morning light began to slip through the curtains. My house was still, my body sore, but my resolve was firm. I wasn't just a retired judge anymore. I was a witness, a victim, and once again a woman who believed in the law. That night, Sophie had thrown a glass, but I was the one who decided what shattered and what didn't. When the police officer finished taking my statement, the morning sun had already started slipping through the curtains. The house felt still heavy, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Upstairs, I could hear the faint sound of movement. Ethan's voice, soft and panicked, mixed with Sophie's muffled sobs. When they came down, the air changed instantly. Sophie's eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. Ethan's hands shook as he tried to explain to reason to beg. He looked at me the same way he did when he was a child caught doing something wrong, hoping love would be enough to erase the consequences. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking, "please don't do this. It was just an accident. She didn't mean to." For a moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to pretend this could be undone with a simple apology and a promise to do better. But the throbbing pain at my temple and the dried blood on my blouse said otherwise. "Some things can't be undone with words, Ethan," I said softly. "No one has the right to hit another person. Not in anger, not by accident, not ever. And certainly not in this house." He shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. "She was drunk. She lost control. You know she's been under stress. If we just give her a chance," I cut him off gently. "I gave her 6 months of chances. I gave her my home, my patience, and my respect. This isn't a mistake anymore. It's a choice." The officer stood quietly, his notebook in hand, waiting for me to finish. Sophie wouldn't meet my eyes. Her silence was louder than any defense she could have made. "I need to file the report," I told the officer. My voice was steady, but my heart was breaking. Ethan looked between us like a man watching his world collapse. "You're really going to call the police on your own family?" he asked. I took a slow breath before answering. "Justice doesn't stop at the front door, Ethan. You taught me that when you were little. Remember, you once told me it wasn't fair when a teacher played favorites. You were right then and I'm right now. Fair is fair even when it hurts." He looked stunned, as if he didn't recognize me. Or maybe he didn't want to. I could see the boy he used to be, kind, gentle, terrified of conflict fighting inside the man who stood before me. When the officer asked Sophie to come outside to sign the paperwork, Ethan's panic grew. He grabbed my hand, his voice trembling. "Please, Mum, don't ruin this. We can fix it as a family." My heart cracked a little more. There are moments as a parent when you realize love can't protect your child from pain, especially the kind they bring on themselves or the kind they choose to stay in. "Sweetheart," I said quietly, "families don't stay silent when someone gets hurt. They face the truth even when it's ugly. That's how they heal." Sophie finally spoke, her voice cold and sharp. "You think you're saving him? You're just making him choose." Ethan looked at her, then at me, torn in half. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, the invisible war I had just declared. Not between me and Sophie, but between love and justice, between mother and protector. When the officer led Sophie toward the door, she turned to me with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The sound of the door closing was answer enough. Ethan stood frozen, tears streaking down his face. "She's my wife," he whispered. "And I'm your mother," I said softly. "And this is my house. Violence has no place in it." He hesitated for a moment, then turned and followed her out the door. The echo of his footsteps down the driveway was the loneliest sound I've ever heard. When the silence finally settled, I sat down at the same dining table where everything had fallen apart. The blood had dried on my sleeve. The glass was still missing from the cabinet. For the first time in my life, enforcing justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss. But deep down, I knew this was the only way forward. Because love without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. That morning, I didn't just sign a police report. I signed the end of the illusion that love alone could fix what violence had already broken. A week after the assault, the bruises on my temple had faded to a dull purple, but the unease inside me hadn't faded at all. The house was quiet now, too quiet. Ethan and Sophie had moved out the day after the police came, claiming they needed space to figure things out. But the silence they left behind didn't feel like peace. It felt like a warning. I spent those first few days replaying everything in my head. The glass, the shouting, the look in Sophie's eyes. Something about that moment had felt rehearsed, not impulsive, not drunken rage calculated. It wasn't just anger, it was control. And control, I'd learned over the years, is the language of manipulation. That realization kept me up at night. I couldn't stop wondering, what else had she been hiding? I decided to call someone I trusted completely. Rick Dalton, an old colleague from my years in the justice system. Rick had been a detective back then, sharp and thorough, the kind of man who could find the truth buried under a mountain of lies. He'd retired a few years before me now, running a small private investigation agency. When he picked up, his voice carried that same calm authority I remembered. "Ellie," he said, using my old nickname, "it's been a long time." "What's going on?" "I need your help, Rick," I told him. "And it's personal." I gave him the short version, the assault. The police report the tension that had been brewing for months. I didn't have to explain the rest. He'd seen enough domestic cases to fill in the blanks. "Send me what you have," he said simply. "I'll start looking into her background." Quietly. 3 days later, he called back. His tone was different, measured, cautious. "Ellie, you might want to sit down for this." He sent me a file by email. It was thick with notes, screenshots, and financial documents. I printed it all out, spreading the pages across my desk like puzzle pieces. The picture that came together was far worse than I'd imagined. Sophie had been fired from her job 3 months earlier. There had been no promotion, no late nights at the office like she'd claimed. She was unemployed, and she had hidden it from everyone, even Ethan. Then came the debts. Over $700,000 spread across 5 credit cards. 2 of them were in Ethan's name. She had forged his signature or used his information to open new accounts. The spending patterns were erratic designer purchases, transfers to unfamiliar accounts, cash withdrawals that didn't add up. It got worse. There were records of large withdrawals, hundreds of thousands of dollars from Ethan's retirement fund. Those transactions required authorization or password access. Ethan would never have allowed that. I felt my chest tighten as I flipped through the pages. But what stopped me cold were the screenshots. Messages between Sophie and her friends dripping with disdain. In one, she joked about putting up with the old lady until she kicks the bucket, followed by a laughing emoji. Another message read, "Once Ethan gets the house, it's all smooth sailing. She can't live forever." I stared at those words for a long time, my hands shaking slightly. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was intent. For years, I had believed Sophie's attitude was rooted in insecurity or immaturity. But this was different. This was strategy. Every action she had taken, the move into my house, the manipulative sweetness toward Ethan, even the outbursts, fit into a larger pattern. She wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law. She was a predator, a financial one. I called Rick again, my voice low but steady. "Keep digging," I said. "I need to know how deep this goes." He didn't hesitate. "Understood. But Ellie, be careful. If she's desperate for money and thinks she's about to lose her access, people like her don't go down quietly." I thanked him and hung up, staring at the folder in front of me. The word evidence was written across the front in my handwriting, underlined twice. That night, I locked the folder in my desk drawer and sat in the dark for a long while. The truth had finally surfaced, but it came with a price. It's strange how quickly love can blind us. We tell ourselves we're helping, that forgiveness will fix things, that people just need time to change. But sometimes the people we welcome into our homes aren't lost souls in need of guidance. They're architects of chaos, slowly building their empire on your trust. The line between family and foe had never felt so thin. And as much as it hurt to admit it, I wasn't just dealing with a disrespectful daughter-in-law anymore. I was facing a con artist living under my own roof. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. And with clarity came resolve. Sophie had played her game well, but she forgot one thing: I'd spent 3 decades studying people like her. And now the judge in me was wide awake. The courthouse smelled exactly as I remembered it, clean, paper-polished wood and the faint tang of old coffee from the break room. I had walked through these halls for decades as Judge Martha Lewis, the woman who handed down sentences with precision and calm authority. But that morning, I wasn't the one presiding over justice. I was the one seeking it. It was a strange kind of irony, coming back here not as a judge, but as a victim. The bruising near my temple had faded to a yellow hue, but I could still feel the sting beneath the skin. It wasn't just physical pain. It was the ache of betrayal, the humiliation of being struck in my own home by someone I had welcomed like family. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I'd once ruled in. The benches creaked softly as people shifted, whispering in low voices. Sophie sat at the defendant's table, her face pale but composed. Her lawyer, a young man who looked like he'd barely finished law school, shuffled papers nervously. I wondered if he even understood what kind of woman he was defending. Ethan sat in the back, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles were white. He avoided my gaze. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. Part of me wanted to run to him to hold his hand like I did when he was little and scared of thunderstorms. But I stayed still. This wasn't the time for comfort. When the judge entered, everyone stood. It wasn't me behind the bench this time, but Judge Sarah Jennings, someone I had mentored years ago. She gave me a small nod of recognition before turning her focus to the case. The prosecutor presented my evidence, the photos of my injury, the shattered glass, the police report. It was all neat, factual, undeniable. Then Sophie's lawyer began his defense. He claimed she had been under extreme stress, that alcohol had impaired her judgment, that it was a one-time mistake. He spoke as if a glass thrown at someone's face could ever be excused by a bad day at work. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, steadying myself. The courtroom fell silent. Your Honor. I began, my voice calm but firm. I didn't come here for revenge. I came here because I spent 30 years teaching people that the law protects everyone, or it protects no one. What happened in my home wasn't just a family argument. It was violence. And if we excuse violence just because it happens behind closed doors, then we give it permission to grow. I paused, feeling the weight of my own words. I'm not asking for harsh punishment. I'm asking for accountability, for safety, for the reminder that no one, not even family, is above the law. The judge nodded thoughtfully. She knew I wasn't speaking as a former colleague, but as a woman who had drawn her line in blood and glass. After a brief recess, the decision was handed down. Sophie was convicted of misdemeanor assault. Her sentence: 6 months of community service, mandatory anger management, and a restraining order, 90 days during which she could not come within 100 yards of me or my home. As the judge read the order aloud, I saw Sophie's face go pale. For the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of what she'd done, not because she felt guilt, but because she'd lost control of the narrative. Control had always been her power. Now the law had stripped it away. Ethan stood up as Sophie was escorted out by an officer. His expression was torn. Anger, confusion, heartbreak, all tangled together. "Mum," he said quietly, "you didn't have to do this." I turned to him. "Ethan, I didn't want to, but I had to. He shook his head. She made a mistake. She needs help, not punishment. She'll get help, I said softly. But help doesn't work without consequences. He didn't answer. He just looked at me with eyes that once held trust, now clouded with doubt. Then he turned and followed her out of the courtroom. That was the moment I realized something important. You can't convince someone who isn't ready to see the truth. Love makes people blind, and sometimes it takes time and pain for the fog to lift. I walked out of that courtroom slower than I used to, but not weaker. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I'd spent my whole life using words to argue for justice. Now I understood that actions spoke louder. From that day on, I stopped trying to persuade Ethan. I stopped trying to justify my choices. Instead, I decided to let the truth reveal itself piece by piece until it was undeniable. Because sometimes the most powerful way to teach someone what justice means is to live it. The cafe was half empty that morning, the kind of quiet place where people whispered instead of talked. The smell of roasted beans hung in the air, comforting in a way I hadn't felt in months. I arrived 15 minutes early just to breathe and steady myself. Today wasn't about me. It was about my son finally seeing what I had seen all along. Ethan walked in right on time. Shoulders tense, eyes tired. He'd lost weight too much. His face was pale, his smile forced. He still had that same softness in his eyes, though. The same look he had when he was little and came home bruised from the playground but insisted he'd just fallen. Something never change. We ordered coffee black for me with milk for him. It was our small ritual, one of the few familiar things left between us. For a few moments we sat in silence, the clinking of cups filling the space where words should have been. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Mum, the restraining order has made things complicated. We're sleeping on a friend's couch. Carly's trying to find work, but no one's hiring." I nodded, letting him speak, resisting the urge to interrupt. I knew that tone. Part frustration, part guilt. The kind of voice someone uses when they're trying to convince themselves that everything's fine. "Have you checked your accounts lately?" I asked gently. He frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" I took a slow sip of coffee before sliding an envelope across the table. Inside were copies of bank statements, credit card bills, and screenshots Rick had gathered. "It's about these," I said quietly. He hesitated, then unfolded the papers. His eyes darted from line to line, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. The withdrawals, the credit cards, the signatures that weren't his. "This isn't possible," he said, voice trembling. "I didn't authorize any of this." "I know," I replied. "She did." He shook his head, his hands trembling. "You're wrong. Carly wouldn't—" "Ethan," I said, softly leaning forward. "She already has." I watched as the realization slowly carved its way through him. He sat there, breathing unevenly, trying to make sense of the chaos on paper. Every number, every missing dollar was a small betrayal, each one slicing deeper than the last. He rubbed his temples, whispering, "She said she was paying the bills. She said we were saving." Sometimes I said gently, "The people we love most are the ones who learn exactly how to lie in ways we want to believe." He looked up, eyes glistening. "How did you even get this?" "I hired a private investigator," I admitted. "After the assault, I needed to understand what was really happening." He leaned back, shocked. "You investigated my wife. I protected my son." I corrected. That silence again. But this time it was heavier. He stared at the documents for a long while, then spoke, his voice barely audible. She lost her job months ago, didn't she? Yes. He nodded slowly, like a man sinking into water, realizing how far beneath the surface he'd already gone. Then, almost as an afterthought, he tugged at the collar of his turtleneck sweater. It was warm outside, too warm for that kind of clothing. Ethan, I said carefully, why are you wearing that? He froze. It's nothing. I reached across the table and touched his wrist. He flinched. That was all I needed to know. Please, I whispered. Let me see. He hesitated, then slowly pulled down the collar. My breath caught. Faint yellow and purple marks ran along his neck, finger-shaped bruises, old enough to be fading but still visible. She was angry after the hearing, he said quietly, his eyes unfocused. She said I should have defended her, said I chose you over her. He swallowed hard. She grabbed me before I could walk away. I felt something inside me crack wide open, not anger, not even fear. It was grief. The kind of grief that comes when you realize your child has been suffering in silence right next to you and you didn't see it soon enough. She hurt you, I whispered. He looked away. It's not that simple. She was upset. She didn't mean to. I reached across the table again, this time firmer. Ethan, that's what every abuser says. It's always a bad day, too much stress, too much wine. But bruises don't lie, and love doesn't leave fingerprints. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. I wanted to hold him to tell him everything would be okay. But I'd been a judge long enough to know that healing starts with truth, not comfort. She's taken your money, I said softly. She's taken your peace. You can't let her take your sense of worth, too. He wiped his eyes, his voice breaking. I thought I was helping her. I thought I was the strong one. You were, I said. But being strong doesn't mean staying silent. It means standing up when the person you love crosses a line. We sat there for a long time, both of us staring out the window as the world moved on around us. People laughing, cars passing, coffee cups clinking. Ordinary life carrying on while ours had cracked open. Before we left, Ethan looked at me with a kind of quiet clarity I hadn't seen in months. I need to go home, he said. Not to her, to you. I nodded. Then let's go. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something shift. The bruises might fade, but the truth was finally out in the open. The victim wasn't just me anymore. It was my son. And this time I wasn't just fighting for justice, I was fighting for him. It happened late on a Thursday night, the kind of quiet evening that pretends to be peaceful until it suddenly isn't. Ethan and I were on the couch, watching an old movie neither of us was really paying attention to. For the first time in weeks, the house felt almost normal again. Warm light, steady breathing, no tension hovering in the air. Then came the pounding. It started as a knock, sharp and impatient, then louder, then furious. Each hit rattled the front door, the kind of sound that makes your chest tighten even before your brain catches up. Ethan's face went pale. It's her, he whispered. My stomach dropped. I didn't have to ask who he meant. The shouting started before I even stood up. Ethan, open this door. I know you're in there. Sophie's voice, raw and slurred, sliced through the silence. She sounded unhinged, desperate, like someone whose world had finally started slipping out of her control. Don't open it, I said firmly, grabbing my phone. My hands were steady, though my heart wasn't. She's violating the restraining order. Ethan sat frozen. His fists clenched on his knees. She'll calm down. Just give her a second. No, I said. She won't. The banging got louder, the handle jerking violently. I could hear her breathing on the other side, heavy, erratic. Then came the sound of glass breaking a porch light, shattering under her fist. 911. "What's your emergency?" the operator asked as soon as I dialed. "This is Martha Lewis," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "My daughter-in-law is violating a restraining order. She's outside my home trying to break in." Within minutes, the wail of police sirens cut through the night. Sophie was still screaming when the squad car pulled into the driveway, her words turning into incoherent sobs and curses. The officers moved quickly, professional and calm. They didn't need an explanation, they'd heard this story before. Ethan stood by the window, trembling as they placed handcuffs on her. "She looks different," he murmured, almost to himself. I didn't respond. I just watched, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. For all her cruelty, I had once hoped Sophie would change. But some people don't change, they just run out of chances. As the officers drove her away, the street fell silent again. The only sound left was Ethan's quiet breathing beside me. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither did I. The next morning, Detective Harris from the department called. He'd been assigned to handle Sophie's case. His voice was polite but heavy. "Mrs. Lewis, I thought you should know our background check turned up some troubling findings. He went on to explain that Sophie's arrest had triggered a deeper investigation. There were 2 prior cases on record, one in Atlanta and one in Dallas, both involving financial fraud and domestic violence. Different names, different partners, same pattern. She had reinvented herself each time, leaving behind a trail of debt destruction and broken people. In both cases, the victims had withdrawn charges after settlements were reached, money exchanged for silence. But now, with multiple offenses spanning states, the prosecutors weren't going to let her walk away again. When Ethan heard, he didn't speak for almost a full minute. He just sat there, eyes, empty lips, trembling. "So, she's done this before," he finally said. "Yes," I said. Softly, more than once. He shook his head, disbelief giving way to something darker. "How could I have been so blind?" "You weren't blind," I told him gently. "You were in love, and she knew exactly how to use that." A week later, the bail hearing took place. Sophie appeared in court, wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair unkempt, her arrogance gone. The prosecutor detailed the restraining order violation, the previous fraud cases, and the risk of her fleeing if released. Her attorney argued for leniency, claiming she was misunderstood, a victim of her own mistakes. The judge listened, then spoke in the calm, clipped tone I knew so well. "Given the pattern of deception, history of violence and flight risk, bail is denied." Those words landed like a gavel strike on Sophie's fate. She was remanded to county jail, pending trial. Ethan was sitting beside me in the courtroom. When he heard the verdict, he exhaled shakily, like he'd been holding his breath for months. "She really fooled me," he said quietly. "All that time, every word, every smile." He trailed off, unable to finish. I put a hand on his arm. "She fooled all of us. But her lies don't define you. What you do next does." For a long time we sat in silence, the same silence that had once felt suffocating. But this time it felt different. Not empty cleansing, like a wound finally beginning to close. As we left the courthouse, Ethan stopped for a moment at the steps, watching the officers escort Sophie away. She turned her head just long enough for their eyes to meet. He didn't look away. "She's not who I thought she was," he said. "But maybe now I can finally start being who I am." I nodded. "That's what justice really is, Ethan. Not revenge, not punishment, just the truth setting you free." The fall of Sophie wasn't about her losing control. It was about Ethan finally taking his back. And as the courthouse doors closed behind us, I knew that for the first time in a long while, we were walking towards something that looked a lot like peace. When Ethan finally came home, it felt as if the house exhaled for the first time in months. The tension that had once lived in every corner was gone, replaced by quiet. A peaceful kind of quiet, not the heavy silence of fear. He slept for nearly 2 days straight, his body and mind catching up on rest they hadn't known in years. On the third morning, he walked into the kitchen holding a paint catalogue. His eyes clearer than I'd seen them in a long time. "I think I want to repaint my room," he said. "Something light. Maybe blue." We spent that afternoon at the hardware store standing in front of rows of colour swatches with names like Morning Sky and Blue Promise. He chose one called After the Storm. I didn't say it out loud, but I couldn't have picked a better name myself. Over the next week, we painted together slowly, carefully, like each brushstroke was part of a healing ritual. We moved furniture, opened the windows, and let the fresh air in. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. Other times he'd tell me bits and pieces about the past 2 years, the manipulation, the fear, the moments he thought love meant enduring pain. I didn't interrupt or correct. I just listened. Because that's what healing needs, most space and understanding. He started therapy soon after. Twice a week he'd come home with red eyes, but a lighter spirit. He was learning to name what had happened and to separate guilt from growth. He told me his therapist said that recovery wasn't about forgetting. It was about rebuilding on stronger ground. Meanwhile, the legal chapter closed quietly. Sophie took a plea deal, 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She also forfeited any claim to Ethan's assets or future inheritance. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability, the first honest thing she'd faced in years. When Ethan heard the final verdict, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and said, "I hope she gets help." That was my son. Even after everything, his heart still leaned toward compassion. Months passed. The house began to feel like a home again. We cooked together, planted new flowers in the garden, even laughed over old family photos. One afternoon, Ethan told me he'd been invited to speak at a conference about domestic abuse, specifically about male victims, a topic too many people still ignored. He was nervous, pacing around the living room with his note cards. "What if I say the wrong thing?" he asked. "Then you take a breath and keep going," I said. "You're not speaking for perfection, you're speaking for truth." When the day came, I sat in the audience, surrounded by rows of strangers. Ethan stepped onto the stage wearing a simple blue shirt, the same color as his newly painted room. His hands shook a little as he adjusted the microphone. "My name is Ethan Lewis," he began, "and I used to think abuse couldn't happen to someone like me. I thought I was strong, logical, too aware. But pain doesn't care about logic. It finds cracks and seeps in quietly. I didn't even know I was a victim until I saw myself hiding in my own home." The room was completely still. He spoke about manipulation, fear, and the shame men often feel when admitting they've been hurt. He talked about how silence protects the wrong people, and how healing begins the moment you stop apologizing for being broken. Then he paused, his voice steady, but full of emotion. "A broken glass didn't destroy my life," he said. "It saved it." I felt tears rising before I could stop them. That moment, the same moment that once shattered our lives, had become his turning point. His reason to speak, his proof that broken things can still reflect light. When he finished, the entire room stood up applauding. It wasn't polite clapping. It was gratitude, connection, recognition. Ethan smiled, humble and real, the kind of smile that comes only after surviving something that should have crushed you. As I watched him standing under those stage lights, his face calm and his voice strong. I whispered to myself, sometimes we have to break completely before we can be whole again. The sky outside that day was the same color as his room, soft, open, and endless. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like a beginning.